Broadcasting the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ from El Paso, Texas to the world and bringing you into God's presence. Experience the difference. You'll never be the same. Don't just watch TV. Watch Persistence Works Television Network, PWTN.
Hello, everybody. God bless you. Hey, this is another bright day, a beautiful day, and I'm so glad coming your way today. You are watching Global Politics Today, and we are focusing on Africa. This is a weekly show that we bring to you on our TV network, Persistent Works TV network platform, where we take time to x-ray different part of the world, global politics. We focus on cities and nations and states to look at what's happening and to also try to provide solutions and to get to the root of the problems most times, because sometimes we deal with problems from the symptoms of problems. We never get to the root. So the purpose of this broadcast is to try to x-ray the problems, the global politics and issues, and try to see how best to deal with them, especially from a Christian worldview. So welcome to Global Politics Today on Persistent Works TV Network. We are focusing on Africa today. I'm your host, as always, Bishop Paul Vincent, and I'm so glad to announce to you that we are now streaming on 15 different platforms. We are streaming on our Persistent Works TV network. We're also streaming on Roku, on Fire TV, on Apple TV. We are streaming on our two apps, our Android app, our iPhone app. We are streaming on our website, persistentworks.tv. We are also streaming on all the leading social media platforms, from YouTube to Twitter, to LinkedIn, to Facebook, our two Facebook pages. So wherever you're watching us from, I welcome you today, and I want to invite you, hey, share this broadcast. Listen, we have information that is going to revolutionize your thinking and going to help you to see better and clearer, especially as relates to global politics, relating to Africa. So please help me share this video, especially if you're watching us on social media. Copy the link and share in groups you belong to in your world. And if you're watching us on our TV network, on Roku, on Fire TV, invite somebody to watch. Let it be a blessing. Let this help open the eye of somebody. Today's broadcast is going to be eye-opening, I guarantee you, because I do take time to study and research and get to the root of these things. Now, I think I am best suited to talk about Africa. Why? Because I'm an African originally from Nigeria. I grew up in Africa, so I observed Africa from the inside, and then I moved out of Africa for over close to 20 years now, and I've observed Africa from outside. And having served in the U.S. military, still serving as a reserve, by the way, having been in the U.S. military, so I'm also privy to observe Africa from the government military standpoint. So I'm bringing a perspective to this discourse as to someone who is in the know, who have experienced some of the things we'll talk about. It's not just something I read in the books. It's something I was born, I grew up in, I know for certain, and some of those are from things I've observed from outside. So my goal is to really get to the root of the problem of Africa. Now, when you are talking about a problem or a situation, it's not always like, if you go to the hospital, by the way, the doctor doesn't treat your symptom. You may say, I have headache, I have stomachache. They don't treat your symptom. They try to run tests to find out, to get to the root of the problem. Because if they can get to the root of the problem, then they are able to treat your problem, to treat your sickness, to heal you. But if they are not able to get to the root of it, you may treat the symptoms, nothing serious is going to happen. Because guess what? The root of the problem is still there. Sometimes I believe and I think the problem in Africa and in many other nations around the world is that we fail to address the root of the problem, to tackle the problems from the root, and we are treating the symptoms. So what we are going to do today is that we are going to try to get to the root of the problem in Africa. As you all know, there have been recent coups all across Africa in the past 2 years, about 6 of them. There have been a coup in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, recently in Gabon. The last time we did a global focus on, a focus on Niger, which was an eye-opening one. But you see, I was going to do a focus on Gabon, which is the latest coup. But I decided to give it a holistic approach because The problem is not just Niger or Gabon or Mali and all that. Africa's problem is holistic. Most of the, and by the way, there may be other coups coming up. So Africa's problem, they are very similar, because the problem in Niger is the same problem they had in Mali, why the military took over, same in Guinea, same in all of these places. So there are things they have in common. So my goal in today's discourse, in today's broadcast, is to x-ray the problem of Africa. Let's get to the root of it. Let's not just deal with the symptoms of a military takeover, of bad governance. Let's get to the root of it. How did we get here as Africa, as a people, as nations, as a continent? How did we get here? And what is the way forward? So I've taken time to put together some videos that will help drive and make this point and drive home this point. But by way of introduction, I want to say that in diagnosing Africa's problem and getting to the root of it, I will say that the root of African problem is the Berlin Conference. And what do you mean? What do I mean by that? Berlin Conference is the conference where the Western world, the European nations, got together and decided to slice up Africa, and they all took shares of who got what part of Africa. They went and colonized. Now, that became the root of, so it's normally known as the scramble for and partition for Africa. If you did a little of history, you will have read that. And by the way, some of these histories are being suppressed, especially in recent time. But I've taken time to put together some videos that will help throw more light, that will help educate you and I, that will help expose and get to the root of this problem. So I want you to watch these videos. Now, after it, I'm going to come back. We are now going to talk about the colonial rule and the problem of control in Africa, because everything you see is all about, even though after the colonial rule, they seem to have left, the colonial masters, Western nations seem to have left Africa. No, they didn't leave. There is still a serious interest in to control Africa, to control their resources, to exploit their resources. That is the bottom of the problem. But the root of it is the Berlin Conference. So I wanted to watch this video and I'll be back. And don't go away. And by the way, invite somebody to watch. Pay attention to this. Take note if you want to. And when I get back, we are going to continue the discussion to get to explore what these root problems are, and at the same time, the way forward and how to provide solutions to Africa's problems. So watch this.
Watching Persistence Works Television Network, PWTN.
Africa is a large continent home to immense culture and history. Surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea to the north, the Indian Ocean to the southeast, and the Atlantic Ocean to the west. It is the world's second largest and second most populous continent. It contains 54 countries and is extremely diverse in terms of ethnicity and language. The borders of these countries were largely decided by European nations during the late 19th and early 20th century in what is known as the scramble for Africa. The Sahara is a defining feature of Africa, the largest desert in the world. The Sahara's sheer size and magnitude acted as a major obstacle for communication, trade, and exchange of ideas. However, there is evidence of Roman expeditions and explorations who were able to move across the desert and into the interior of Africa, with the aim to secure sources of gold, salt, and spices. For centuries, Arabs also maintained trade relations with the vast empires of West Africa, such as the Ghana and Mali Empire, establishing trade routes that secured gold, ivory, and slaves. The Portuguese began expeditions down the west coast of Africa in the 15th century, and history tells us of the profound effect that followed. During the 1480s, the explorer Diogo Coe was the first to establish contact with the Congo Kingdom, situated south of the Congo River. The Congo Kingdom was eager to make use of Portuguese teachers and craftsmen, and the Congo kings allowed Catholic missionaries to work among their people. The Portuguese traded guns, cloth, and other European luxuries for slaves who were captured by the Congo in wars against rival kingdoms. By the 17th century, Portugal and other European powers began to settle along the coast of Africa. Europeans would buy slaves in Africa, transport them to the Americas, and exchange them for valuable goods like sugar, coffee, and tobacco, which were then sold at premium prices in Europe. Arguably, between the 16th and 18th century, over 12 million Africans were enslaved and transported in harsh conditions to work on plantations in the Americas. In the south of Africa, the first European settlement was established by the Dutch East India Company, where merchants used the location as a waypoint for ongoing voyages to the Dutch East Indies. They came into contact with the Khoikhoi, a nomadic indigenous population of southwestern Africa comprising of hundreds of clans. Over time, this settlement, known as the Cape of Good Hope, grew in size, resulting in the Khoikhoi losing land and cattle to the Dutch, who adopted the name Boer, meaning farmer. Due to a shortage of labour, the Dutch imported slaves from Mozambique, Madagascar, and many Indonesian islands. The Cape of Good Hope came under the control of the British during the Napoleonic Wars. The abolition of slavery ended slavery in the Cape in 1834. In 1835, the Boers embarked on the Great Trek, as the abolition of the slave trade resulted in financial catastrophe. As a result, Dutch citizens known as Voortrekkers moved further inland into Africa. They formed the Free Orange State and Transvaal, which was recognised by the British. In the north, France launched a war of conquest against Algeria in 1830, which would last until 1847. Meanwhile, in the United States, there was a movement to settle freeborn blacks and freed slaves and transport them to Africa. Most whites, and later a small minority of blacks, believed that blacks would be better off in Africa. The American Colonization Society began transporting them to the closest point of Africa to establish a colony in 1822. By 1847, the settlers issued a Declaration of Independence and established the Independent Republic of Liberia. The construction of the Suez Canal in 1869 verified its importance as a route for trade with India and China. And in 1882, Egypt was occupied by British forces during the Anglo-Egyptian War, subsequently revealing the potential riches that Africa offered. There were several European explorers who explored the continent. Perhaps one of the most famous was David Livingstone, a Scottish missionary who attempted to convert the natives he encountered to Christianity and strove to find the source of the Nile. Henry Moult Stanley was famous for his exploration of Central Africa. He worked for King Leopold II of Belgium and helped map out the Congo region. So why were there no major explorations into the interior of Africa before this? Well, there were limited seaworthy rivers, tropical diseases, hostile natives, and weapons were not as advanced as they were in the 19th century. During the 19th century, most European powers experienced a dramatic growth of productivity triggered by industrialization. European countries overproduced goods and were consequently searching for new markets. Interest turned towards the acquisition of land in order to grow agricultural products for European markets. Europeans moved into the interior of Africa to extract raw materials such as rubber, palm oil, gold, copper, and diamonds. These natural resources made Africa a vital resource for the European economy. Understandably, Europe held the technological advantage. Bands of just a few hundred men and barely a handful of machine guns proceeded to overwhelm and obliterate thousands of Africans. The machine gun was a revolutionary gun that could fire rapid shots at an unparalleled speed. The effectiveness of the weapon was obvious in Sudan, where a British force, armed with roughly 20 machine guns and a small number of gunboats, overpowered Sudanese forces and effectively opened the door for colonization.
For 14 weeks and 5 days, between November 15, 1884 and February 26, 1885, European countries prepared and cooked their plans on how to share Africa like a piece of cake. They called it the Berlin Conference. It was at this conference in Berlin, present-day Germany, that African lands were divided on a map, while the Africans themselves were exempted from the meeting. It was not an omission of invitation or a simple oversight. Rather, it was a large-scale legalized daylight robbery. Africans were considered irrelevant and incapable of making meaningful decisions on what happened to or on their lands. Since they were uncivilized, according to these European invaders, they needed help, and the participants of the Berlin Conference were to be their saviors. Towns, lands, and rivers were all portrayed on the map that hung on the wall. With just a ruler and pencil, borders were formed, territories were claimed, and trade routes were created or removed, while historical background, cultural laws, sovereignty, and traditional institutions of a people dating back thousands of years were completely ignored. And just like a piece of cake, Africa, the second largest continent in the world, was shared at a conference table. The Berlin Conference was organized by Otto von Bismarck, the first chancellor of the new German Empire, who was concerned with securing portions of the continent within which exploration had begun. The conference birthed the General Act of the Berlin Conference, which had been nicknamed the Scramble for Africa. The conference consisted of top European nations who were invested in exploring the resources that abound within the continent. This was justified under the guise of civilizing or developing the countries, which they considered barbarian and primitive. This paved the way for the colonization of the African states by the Western countries and eventually robbed the continent of its rich cultural heritage and linguistic diversity. By the time most of these countries would gain independence from their colonial masters during the 20th century, great damage had already been done. The structures and systems that had been laid down by the colonizing nations made inadequate provision for self-sufficiency and thus had a great dependency on their colonizers for survival. So, how did the Berlin Conference come to be, and what impact did it have on Africa as a whole? There was a general belief by the Europeans that Africa belonged to no one in particular and had to be claimed and developed. When the Berlin Conference took place, no African individual or leader was present. Ironically, Africa had experienced a great deal of development before the Europeans. By the 13th century, different empires within Africa had attained global prominence, drawing the attention and curiosity of the Western world. Some stories about the level of wealth contained within the continent seemed too good to be true, but with the discovery of the Congo River Basin in 1874 by Henry Morton Stanley, there was certainty about Africa and its rich resources. One of the leaders who was very interested in these discoveries was King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold had previously formed the International African Society, which had a mission of civilizing Africa. He teamed up with Stanley and eventually created the International Congo Society. This was similar to the former society but had more goals added to be achieved by the society. But Leopold was far from being a sincere man. He was a strategic and cunning leader who wanted to advance his personal wealth with Africa's resources. He began sending explorers who doubled as his representatives in laying claims over a wide expanse of land at the center of the continent. In the course of his civilization agenda for Africa, he secretly bought off investors in the International Congo Society. Stanley went to the area to try to establish the Congo Free State. This was while other European nations were also in the scramble for Congo. France, on discovering Leopold's hidden agenda, sent their own explorer, Pierre Savognin de Brazza, who created Brazzaville and mounted the French flag, while Portugal laid claims as well on the Congo area, which they backed by treaties signed with leaders of the ancient Congo Kingdom. Other European countries began taking interest in a continent of gold they had heard rumors about, and this resulted in competition and great conflict between these nations that were claiming different regions of Africa. Great Britain and France were both having conflicts over West Africa, Portugal in Egypt and Britain in East Africa. Leopold and the French also had conflicts in Central Africa over the Congo area. The German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, whose country was considered an imperial power, also picked up interest in laying claims to African lands. He sought to resolve these conflicts by calling for the Berlin Conference. Bismarck felt these conflicts arose because there was no equal distribution of access to the economic advantage Africa provided, and called for the conference to resolve these irregularities. This proves that the purpose of the Berlin Conference was largely economical and not for developing the African states. Countries such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Belgium, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, and the Ottoman Empire were represented at the conference. The conference began on November 15, 1884, and went on for 14 weeks and 5 days, ending on February 26 of 1885. In the Berlin Conference, territories claimed by European countries were to be legalized, formalized, and then drawn on the map to avoid further conflict. Trade routes were also agreed upon amidst colonies, and a framework for colonizing territories was created. Explorers were to be sent out to explore the African lands. Then, they would proceed to offer protection to the indigenous people of that land by signing treaties with them. Finally, the European explorers or ambassadors would return to their home country with the treaties signed. Then, the government of that country would inform or negotiate with other European countries so that their claim over the African territory would be recognized and uncontested. In all of these establishments, Africans were not included or considered, although it was their land that was being divided. They were regarded as incapable of ruling themselves. It would also be interesting to note that most of the time, the indigenous rulers did not even understand what the treaty was about or what they were signing. In some scenarios, these treaties were signed by makeshift leaders who did not exactly have the authority to do so. However, one African leader saw through the tricks of the Europeans. Menelik, an important leader in Ethiopia who would eventually become emperor, wrote a letter to the participants of the conference clearly stating that Ethiopia would not be needing their protection. Although his letter was ignored, Ethiopia and Liberia were the only African states that were not colonized in the scramble. The Sultan of Zanzibar begged to be present at the conference, but to no avail. Little did he know that he was to be part of the main topic of discussion. The General Act outcome of the Berlin Conference, and it made provisions for different trade routes and the framework for colonization. It addressed different issues bordering on the colonization of the African states. It confirmed the Congo Free State as the private property of King Leopold II, and also confirmed the free trade proposal by making the Niger and Congo rivers free for ship traffic. The General Act also included the signing of the International Prohibition of the Slave Trade. More importantly, it established the principle of effectivity, which stated that powers could only possess colonies if they actually possessed them. This also meant that any country which wanted possession of any territory in Africa would notify other signatory powers for formalization and recognition. The Berlin Conference was a glaring disregard for Africans. The Europeans saw their views, opinions, and ownership over their lands as irrelevant. 14 countries were duly represented at the conference, and at its conclusion, 8 out of the 14 countries started possessing different parts of the African regions. The 6 other participants, such as Austria-Hungary, Russia, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and the United States, did not take any formal possession of any parts of Africa. However, by the end of the 19th century, all African states except Ethiopia and Liberia had been colonized by the Europeans. After the Berlin Conference ended in 1885, it led to the creation of African countries by forcefully merging different ethnic groups, cultures, languages, and people. This, of course, overrode the existing groupings, boundaries, and regions within the continent. The conference legalized what was not legal and created a ground for cooperation between the European countries on taking over the African states. The European countries claimed to offer protection to the countries they overtook. The 1884 and 1885 Berlin Conference would not only be the birthplace of colonization, but also the conflicts within and without countries, state and ethnic groups that still exist to this day. The robbery did not only end with land and territories, but also cultural artifacts, treasures and resources yet to be regained by the continent. It was obvious that the Europeans were wolves in sheep's clothing, fueled by the desire for acquiring Africa's natural resources for the betterment of their countries. As such, there was a need to secure their portions to maintain their industrial sector, which was just starting to grow. To achieve this, they had to secure African territories that would readily provide them with the resources they needed and a market for the goods they produced. A total of 50 countries were carved out of the scramble for Africa. Great Britain took control of Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Nigeria, and Ghana. France took a better part of Western Africa, from Mauritania to Chad, and also Gabon and the Republic of Congo. Belgium and King Leopold II controlled the Democratic Republic of Congo, while Portugal took Mozambique in the east and Angola in the west. Italy got hold of Somalia, then known as Italian Somaliland, and a portion of Ethiopia later on. Germany took Cameroon, Namibia, and Tanzania, while Spain got the smallest territory, which was Equatorial Guinea, the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa. The Berlin Conference, which lasted for over 3 months, still evaded serious problems and questions that were left unanswered. Many of the representatives had not stepped foot on African soil and somehow assumed they could understand and manage the complexities of the African states. The sovereignty of the African states was not recognized, yet treaties were needed to be signed to legalize the relationship between both parties. This in itself was contradictory to the claims of the European states. Although the General Act seemed to prohibit the slave trade, it is on record that over 10 million Africans in the Congo area died under Leopold's leadership due to starvation, diseases, and war. The act was used to gain approval and legitimacy in the public eye by the European countries, but did not in any way alleviate the sufferings and conditions of the locals under their colonial masters. The locals were brutalized and used to further his selfish interest. The concept of free trade was unrealistic, as many of the colonizing countries would not readily allow free trade within countries they had invested heavily in colonizing. For instance, the Congo was operated as a monopoly under Leopold's rule. The conference, which tried to curb the scramble for Africa, further enhanced it. It was presented as a means of creating a platform for peaceful claiming of African states by European states, but it also had its hidden agenda. Germany and Britain were interested in Africa to promote their ambitions and retain their position as the #1 global power over the others, and not for peaceful colonization as assumed. The Berlin Conference held entirely different consequences for the continent involved. For Europe, it was just a failed enterprise, while in Africa, it created long-lasting damage that is still visible to this day. Some of the damages done by colonization have been said to be too large to be repaired. Even after gaining independence, most of these colonized African countries are still ill-equipped to be well run by themselves. Greed and corruption are the order of the day, and conflict still exists within the African borders. Some African diplomats have called for redrawing the African map and redefining the boundaries laid by the colonial masters. But there are also fears that this might aggravate an already politically tense climate. These fears have created another group of the opinion that the colonial boundaries be respected. Nevertheless, this does not suffice for the damages that run deeper in the cracks within the continent. It has been 137 years since the Berlin Conference ended, and one can only help but wonder if Africa would ever recover from the effects of the European invasion and plunder.
Great Britain dominated the African continent with the control of Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, and the Gold Coast. The French occupied vast expanses of West Africa. The Germans controlled modern-day Tanzania, as well as Namibia. The Italians controlled Somalia and Libya, whilst the Portuguese exerted full control over Angola and Mozambique. By 1914, 90% of Africa had been divided between 7 European countries, with only Ethiopia and the African American state of Liberia remaining independent nations.
So that partitioning of Africa back in 1884 and those partitionings remain in place today is responsible for a lot of what has happened in Africa, our inability to grow our economies, our inability to travel from one country to the other. You look at tourism. If you need to go to Africa and visit 3 different countries, you got to send your passport to DC 3 different times. And each time your passport comes back, you got to send it again to another country, 2, 3, 4 weeks before you get your passport back. And then you got to send it back to Washington. At times, those embassies are on the same street. You could have walked from one embassy to the other, but you can't do it. And by the time you get your passport back with the 3rd visa, the visa for the first country is expired. Who needs to go through all that? So you say, forget it, I'm not going to Africa, I'm going to Europe. At every level, what we see happening today in Africa that affects economic development is directly related to what was done in 1884. You try to go from one part of Africa to the other. It's easier to fly into Europe and then come back down. Why? A lot of the airspaces were closed. All of it, thanks to the Berlin Conference. So people don't realize that that decision has everlasting implications on what goes on in Africa. And at the end of the day, it crystallizes down to our failure to grow our economies. Because Africa must speak with one voice. Africa must enter the world stage as one customs union, as one continent, speaking with one voice. That is the only way that Africa can begin to take her rightful place on the world stage. So it's been a lengthy process, thanks to the legacy of colonization. It seems to me that this should have been a slam dunk. It's common sense. But because of interferences from former colonizers that just kept getting in the way. You look, for example, now West Africa is trying to have the West African echo and have one currency for West Africa. Even that process, it has taken decades because they keep getting interference from outside. So yes, efforts have been made, but not in a coordinated way because of influences and interruptions, interference from the outside. France was mostly involved in coups that took place in its former colonies. We've had a total of 67 coups on the continent, and 26 countries were involved. And of the 26 countries, 16 countries were former French colonies.
You are watching Persistence Works Television Network, PWTN.
Hey friends, welcome back. Hey, you are watching Global Politics. We are focusing on Africa. This is Persistent Works TV Network. You are watching. We are streaming on Roku, on Fire TV, on Apple TV, on our 2 apps, our Android app, our iPhone app. We are streaming on our website, persistentworks.tv. We're also streaming on all the leading social media platforms, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, what have you. And I'm your host, as always, Bishop Konepo Vincent. We are getting to the root. We are trying to x-ray the problem of Africa and trying to get to the root of it, because it does no good to treat a problem with sickness by just treating the symptoms. So in trying to x-ray what exactly is wrong with Africa, the problem, the root of it is what we have just seen in this video. So Africa was partitioned at the Berlin Conference. The scramble and petition for Africa, that is the root of the problem. Everything happening in Africa today dates back and roots back to that. Let me give you an instance. Nigeria, for instance, different sects of the nation of Nigeria have been trying to separate the ones called the Biafra nation, the Southeast Igbo-speaking part, because they don't feel they belong. They don't feel they are part of the African nation, the Nigerian nation, because of all that has been happening. And for real, these are strange bedmates that the colonial masters, the British colonial masters, brought together, put together, tried to make to, remain one. They were never one. From time immemorial, they were kingdoms, empires. They had their own cultures, identities, and all that. So in recent years, when they now saw that, you know what, we are not doing this no more. We want to go our own way, and then there is always going to be a fight. So you see that many wars that was fought between 1967 to 1970, there was a Nigerian civil war that was fought mainly because the Biafran nation wants to go their way, and the Nigerian nation says, hey, you know what, you are not going nowhere. Initially, they accepted, but British government talked them into, hey, don't let them go, because that is where the oil resources of the nation is mainly situated. So they fought a war for 3.5 years. Over 3 million were killed, mainly Igbos, Southeast Nigeria were killed in that civil war. Go to Liberia, go to Liberia is a bit more different, you know, and go to even Gabon. Most of all the nations that you see either fighting war or having political turmoil of coup and all that, the root of it is what happened at the Berlin Conference when Africa was partitioned, bringing strange bedmates, redrawing the map and all that. Now, that is by the way. So after the colonial masters had Africa in their pocket, so to speak, in Nigeria, for instance, the Britain ruled for 90 straight years before independence was granted in 1960. So within the time frame of 1960-63, many of them, of course, gained independence because then there was more pressure, and they have now got to know that, hey, you know what, we are no more interested. Thank you for your service. You've got to go. And eventually they let them go and they gave them independence. But listen, the problem still remains this Berlin Conference and the scramble for partition of Africa, because even though independence was given, it wasn't all. They still wanted to control Africa even in post-independence, which was why in French colonial masters, they had what they call the Pact for Continuation of Colonization. And that secret deal pact that they signed, I'm sure those guys, the African nations, Francophone, French-speaking African nation, I'm sure those founding fathers, I'm sure they have no idea what exactly they signed. And this was a pact that made it impossible for them to have a living, for them to really have independence, because France was not going to control their economy. They were going to deposit 85% of their resources with France. And by the way, they still control their resources and everything. So we did more story on that a few weeks ago when we did the story on Niger. But the point is that exploitation of the African resource and the control, even after independence, was still a key issue. So these European nations didn't want to let go completely. And that was how, even though the nations gained independence, they were still pulling the strings, so to speak. And you now have a situation where if a leader, an African leader, allows them to have their way by exploiting the resources and what have you, and bringing over their corrupt money and banking it in those Western nations, which is all public knowledge, as long as you play ball with them, they let you be. But anytime any African nation or leader wants to do the right thing, wants to do what's right for its people, you see that they plot against them. There are coups, there are assassinations, and all of that. The goal is to keep them under control. The whole game, the whole problem is in Africa still remains the control. The colonial master still wants to control Africa. You have it in the Francophone countries, you have it in the Britain, in the Anglophone countries, which are the countries Britain colonized, even though it's more, or it was, within the Francophone speaking countries, which is why in recent years, it's like they've just woken up. There is now more awareness, more education, and some of these guys say, you know what, we are not doing this no more. Let me give you another instance. Uranium, which Niger produces, it actually has been said that France's energy is powered by 30 or 40% of Niger's uranium. That means that every three or five or so households in France is powered by uranium from Niger. Now, at the end of the day, they are literally milking them. Over these years, even though they've had independence, Niger sells uranium sells for over 200 euros at the world market. Paris pays Niger 80 cents, either 80 or 82 cents, which is less than, I mean, how do you, that is even immoral. So it's as if you kind of like take it for free, you go sell it, you make the money. And by the way, 500 billion leaves Africa, Francophone Africa especially, every year into the France's economy. They invest that money, they use it, and then they kind of come back to kind of, oh, we are giving you aid. Now, these are things that many of these nations, especially on the military side, got fed up with. Their eyes got open and they say, you know what, we're not doing this no more. And eventually that was why they kicked France out of Mali, kicked them out of Burkina Faso, and kicked them out of Guinea, these places that had recent coup, which is what exactly they are trying to do. Now, look at what's happening in Niger. That gives you the mindset of some of these nations. They still feel they have that control. Do you know that 14 of those Francophone nations still uses CFA, which is the France's own currency, which it prints for them. They don't even have their own central bank. So you see the control is so massive. So now Niger stands up to them, even though it's the military, and they kind of like, you gotta go. And France is like, we're not leaving. You can see that same mindset of the colonial rule, colonial masters, we own you, we control you, you can't tell us what to do. Even though he kind of said, oh, France will say, oh yeah, you know, you are illegitimate, we want the legitimate guys. The only reason why to them, he's legitimate is because he lets them have their way. Now, let's use, for instance, Gabon. The Ali Bongo guy who was overthrown by the military in Gabon, he has been in office since 2009 after his father died. His father was in office for 42 or so years. Combined, they have been in office, one family has been in office for 55 or 57 years. And this current Gabon president that was ousted, he even had a stroke. And that's to tell you the problem of Africa. He should have come to take care of himself. The guy is not even can't even function, can't work well. He had a stroke, and yet he clinges to power, and France allows him, supports him, backs him. A family that has been there 50-something years. Why? Because they let them have their way. They can make their oil, make their resources, as long as you know, and of course they do channel, you know, much of the corrupt money to their family. So you see that as long as you play ball with the colonial powers, even though they've let go, they say, oh, no more colonialism, but they are still in the game of controlling. As long as you let them play ball, they let you have your way. But the moment you say no, that's when they remember the issue of democracy, the issue of what kind of democracy do you say call democracy, that somebody has been in office, a so-called elected leader, the family for 55 years. That's not right. So at the end of the day, and by the way, if you follow the news, you will see that after he was ousted by the military and his house was, you know, searched, they had raw cash, billions of dollars or euro, whatever that currency is, that was stashed in his houses. And these are just the ones you saw. There are many others stashed out in banks across Europe, or in France especially. Now, that is to tell you that the whole problem of Africa is the Berlin Conference and the scramble for partition of Africa, because even though they have let go and said you have your independence, they still remote control, they still want to have control. Can you imagine the government of Niger, at least the new government, saying to France, you gotta leave, saying to the military, you gotta leave, and they're like, we are not leaving. Somebody comes to your house and you want to get you say, okay, you know, it's time to go. You say, I'm not going. Who does that? That is the same mindset that gave birth to Berlin Conference, that gave birth to the petition, scramble and petition for Africa. So, even though they gain independence with the mindset of giving freedom to African nations, but that freedom was never really attained. Another way by which they continue to exploit Africa is economic exploitation. And this is done through World Bank, through IMF and their loans. Many times growing up in Nigeria, I remember many years ago, when the economy was struggling because of some of the policies of the government that were implemented by the Western powers that say, hey, you know what, you've got to put this in place, and then they will get in trouble. So the military takes over, and even the military guys, they were like, oh, you know, we are willing to give you loans to help you, but you got to devalue your currency, you got to introduce austerity measure. I still remember growing up when President Babangida then in the 80s, he introduced austerity measure. Every one of us was like, what's that? And the price of everything, inflation was off the roof. And guess what? So they were able to give them loan, IMF loan. Now, these loans are with interest that are cut neck rates, interest. And these are loans that they used to keep you in captivity, continuous economic captivity, so that you have no life and you pay these loans for into kingdom come. Even you are paying the interest, not even the main loan. So they continue economic exploitation through the loans and through all of this medium. And of course, it's not only Africa. There are many other developing countries that have the same problem, which is why BRICS. I did a case study in our last edition on BRICS. If you missed that, go watch my the broadcast on the BRICS, which is what gave birth or is giving birth to that. So at the end of the day, you see control through economic, you see control through the resources. In fact, control through political control. They literally call the shot in many of these African nations. You do their bidding, they let you stay. You don't do their bidding, they kick you out. They press the buttons. And one of the good case studies of this was in Burkina Faso. Thomas Sankara, if you read the history or if you watch the video, he was one of the military guys who he got fed up with this whole thing we're talking about. The leaders taking orders from the Western world and running the economic to the ground. They exploiting and taking the resources out of the nation, and everybody is suffering. The nation never develops, and he took over the government. It's a long story. You can go read the story or go look it up and watch it. Now, Thomas Sankara, if I've watched that video, I've read about it. He had the good of his people in heart. He was the kind of leader you would say is a great leader. He was there for the people, had policies that were going to benefit his people. But problem was, he wasn't going to play ball with the Western powers because he wasn't going to take their loan. He wasn't going to take their either IMF or World Bank loan because they needed these loans for you to take it. That's something they used to hold and control you. And this wasn't going to happen. And he was going to initiate policies that would benefit the people, not the Western powers. At the end of the day, they weren't happy about it. And then they pressed buttons and was able to manipulate and use his bosom friend to eventually assassinate him and took over. And when this guy took over, he went into bed. He went to bed with IMF, with World Bank, with the Western nations, all the things that this other guy didn't want to do, which angered these guys, the Western powers. He kind of like played ball with them, and he was good to go. Now, this is the problem of Africa. Even till today, you see many elections, so-called elections happening in African nations. Many times, if those players, if they play ball, if they allow the colonial powers to still have their way, they let them be. Whenever it's not happening their way, then that's when you all of a sudden hear, the issue of democracy. So the problem is they get involved in change of governments when it doesn't favor them, even if they have to sponsor coup, assassinations and all that. They get involved, they continue to use economic exploitation, they use the resources of Africa against them. They exploit it, they take it, and they give them like peanuts. Now, this is the situation, and that is the root of Africa's problem. Now, the other problem Africa has, which brings me to, what I want to remember, I'm an observer, I'm an insider as an African who have lived and grown in Africa, and now outside of Africa, I've taken time to observe, to study, to research, to look at this. Why is Africa's problem? What is our problem with the leaders, with the people, and all that? And I've come up with 7 things that I would say are the obstacles to Africa's growth. I took time to do a research and to discover from my personal experience in my original nation, Africa, Nigeria, and other African nations. I mean, it's the same. Wherever nation you go to is the same. So, and you can see from the video that we put together, you could see that even the AU ambassador to UN. Now, by the way, that lady was kicked out of the UN when she began to expose these things, and she began to, call out France and all of that. They weren't happy. They pressed the button and she was kicked out. In 2019, it was all over the media. If you followed that story, people were protesting. We are even like writing petition for her to be reinstated. But the reality and the truth is this: Africa has its own problem, of course, and that's one of what some of what I want to highlight now. What are the obstacles to Africa's growth? How can Africa move forward? And from all I have seen and read and listened to, and I'm sure you could glean some of these things from what you've watched from this. The 7 things I want to say, I want to address as the root of, or the obstacles to African growth. Number 1, the obstacle of free trade across Africa. As you can see in that video, for instance, if you travel to Europe, you are trying to go from Germany to Belgium to France, anywhere. I mean, like, you don't need to have a visa. For instance, you get a visa. Those of us in the US, I have done Europe missions a couple of times. I travel from France to Germany to Cyprus to Netherlands. All of those places, you don't need a visa. Of course, being a US citizen, I don't need visa. But for somebody coming from a nation where they need visa, you just get a visa, especially the Schengen visa. Schengen has enlarged to like 29 nations or so. So literally, you get a visa to a nation in Europe, you can travel across the rest of Europe. You don't need no more visa. Africa is supposed to have a free trade, to be able to free travel within Africa, so that they can be able to travel across. So free trade, free travel across Africa. These are 2 key components, because remember that Africa was more united, even though they were different kingdoms, empires, but they did have trade. They did have a lot of things in common before the artificial separation and boundary, demarcations. So the one of the problems that Africa has to overcome to really move forward and to grow is the obstacle of free travel within Africa. They need to abolish many of the need for visa to travel within. If you are traveling from Nigeria to Niger to Chad, even though within West African sub-region, they have what they call ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. So if you have the ECOWAS passport, you can travel within ECOWAS sub-region without a visa, which is good. Now they need that at the whole Africa level, whereby you are traveling from Ghana, you want to go to Togo, you want to go to Kenya, you want to go to South Africa, you don't need the visa, just like in Europe. And by the way, let's look at the US just like Africa. The United States is as big as Africa, even though Africa is more populated. If you are traveling, once you have a visa, or you are here in New York, you are going to California, you don't need a visa. Even though, yeah, we see US as a country, but it's just like a continent, Flying from New York to California is just like flying from Lagos to Egypt or Addis Ababa or even further. So at the end of the day, they need to be able to introduce free travel within Africa to help with trade. They need to introduce free trade within Africa to be able to trade within, because Africa is rich. Africa is rich in resources, which is why the nations, European nations, invaded it in the first place. So the trade, free trade within Africa is going to be one of the strengths that will help it economically. And then the third thing I've discovered, the third obstacle, I said there are 7 obstacles I've discovered. The first is obstacle of free trade across Africa. The second is obstacle of free travel within Africa. The third is obstacle of Western nations trying to keep Africa down and trying to hinder them from industrializing. Now, that's for their own benefit, because, if you fulfill your potential and become all you need to be, they are going to be at a loss. So they try to do everything possible to keep Africa down. And which is why many of the times, they will often prefer to give aid. Africa doesn't need aid and shouldn't be asking for aid, because guess what? Africa has the resources that is actually being exploited by the other nations of the world, the Western nations. So one of the problems is that the Western nations are exploiting and trying to keep Africa down, trying to hinder its industrialization, because they know that when Africa fulfills its potential, it's going to affect them. Just look at what's happening in Niger, in Burkina Faso and those places. Niger especially. Why is France bent on not leaving? Why is France, when you talk of interest, French interest, what interest do you have in another nation? It's a sovereign nation, supposed to be. But the problem is they have controlled them, made them, exploited them for years. It's become normal, and they have, those guys, as poor as Niger is, they have helped to power the energy and the economy of France for decades, and they want to have business as usual. So things have to change, and the Western nations have to understand that you need to help Africa develop and grow and not put them down. You need to help it to industrialize. You need to be partners with Africa, not a subject master, master slaves relationship. The fourth or the fifth problem that is obstacle that I see, which is one of the ones that have really eaten Africa up, is the obstacle of war and terrorism in Africa. Many times these are artificial, because when I watch this video, when you watch that video, you will see when the colonial masters partitioned Africa, and they pick up whichever nation they decide to pick up, and they sign treaties with them. In signing that treaty, they will say to them, we are here to protect you. Protect you from what? These guys, these nations of Africa and tribes and kingdoms have been there for ages, for thousands of years or hundreds of years, and they have been just fine. Of course, they have maybe their problems, fight their wars locally, but they don't need your protection. So when they say, we need to sign this treaty so we can protect you. Protect you from what? Well, maybe protect them from the next colonial power that want to come invade you. So the problem is that terrorism often and wars often are man-made. Look at Libya, for instance. Libya under Gaddafi, and of course it wasn't perfect, it wasn't a great place, but Gaddafi did much of the greater job, a better job than most African leaders in providing infrastructure, and social welfare programs. And he nationalized the oil, national oil, the oil resource of the nation, and used it to develop the nation. Whereas in the past, they have exploited it, took it out, and just gave them peanuts. Now, he was not like in the good books of the Western powers. And he has his problem, of course. When you look at they taking him out and all of that, what Libya is a sorry sight. Now, if you see before and after picture, the war and all the killing and literally slavery is happening there like broad daylight. Like I said before, the Nigerian Civil War, these are wars that shouldn't have happened in the first place. Terrorism, most of the terrorism you talk about, we see happening, are inventions of the Western powers, because many times on two grounds, there are times when you push people to the wall and they fight back, and that becomes terrorism. Of course, there are times when they now look to the bad guys to be able to partner with to unleash mayhem. Now, we are a case where, like, one of the problems in Niger, why the military took over, from what I've read and videos I've watched, the military has a problem where they are fighting terrorists, and they are trying to, sometimes they are in view, and they are trying to take out some of the major ones, and they need authorization from the president. He's like, hey, get permission from France military. They are in Niger. And why in the world will a Niger military need permission of France military to take out the bad guy, if really that's what they're there for? And when they reach out to those guys, they're like, don't do it. So these are some of the things that you look at, say, is the terrorism and war in Africa, are they man-made? Are they invented? Are they part of the ways to keep the business going? And by the way, you know that the business of terrorism and security and all that is a multi-billion-dollar. And I'm telling you this from being in the military. The U.S. military budget, when I did the issue on BRICS last time, I gave more details on these. The budget is, I think, 1.something trillion, 1.7 or so trillion. I can't remember the exact figures now. Now, this is something that goes to, there are nations that doesn't have that kind of budget, whole nation. When you look at nations that have been fighting war, why did those wars, some of those wars, even happen in the first place? They were, in many cases, they were unnecessary, they were unneeded, but somebody has to make those wars happen. Somebody has to kickstart this thing so that, the military industrial complex has to do business. The military industrial complex has to sell their weapons, they have to do business, they have to make profit. So many times these wars are not necessary, but they are invented, so that some people can be in power, can remain, in power. In Nigeria, for instance, the security budget, for instance, of most state governors, the state government, they have a security vote, they have a security budget which is unaccounted for. This, like say, like R1 billion or thereabout, that is for security. And you know, when it comes to security, that's the kind of money that any government will approve, because hey, who wants to be bombed or killed also? And that makes room for corruption. It makes room for people embezzling money and not accounting for it. So that becomes a problem. The obstacle of war and terrorism across Africa, and those fueling it, most of the time, the same Western colonial powers fueling the wars and terrorism, so that so you can be in business. So hey, we are here to provide protection for you, but we are also the one causing the problem in the first place. You can't be the problem and be the solution at the same time. So that is one of the problems I've seen in African usually. And by the way, you also know, if you have followed the case with Niger, you also know that they are pushing the Western powers, the France, and I don't know how much US is involved, and I hope US stays away from this with France. But you know that France is actually lobbying ECOWAS to go into war, to go fight Niger. And we already know how these things happen. You know, when Liberia war happened and other wars, you know that apart from the human capital, loss of lives, it takes decades to rebuild. And you know, war, you demolish and destroy and destroy everything. So it's easy to push people into war, but the consequence that many times these powers they don't care. All they want is whatever their interest, they want to protect is. And I did a video some time ago saying, hey, Nigeria or ECOWAS, you better not get into this war, because it's not going to be funny. Because in this case, as you know, if you follow this whole case, Russia itself is also interested and involved. So if there is ever a war between ECOWAS, Nigeria, ECOWAS, and Niger, you are going to see that other world powers will be involved. Of course, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea have already said they are going to, fight with. They're going to support Niger. So you are going to see ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. You are going to see them divided, a couple of nations, 5, 6, 7 of them versus the rest. And you're going to see France supporting the ECOWAS guys. Maybe US, I hope they don't get involved in that. But Russia supporting the other guys. So you see, it will be a kind of a carryover of Ukraine war, the US NATO war happening in Ukraine, which is more like a proxy war. You will see a carryover of it to Africa, which shouldn't be. But many times that have been the case in the past, which is why Africa should stay away from war and should fight terrorism headlong, because that has been an obstacle to growth in Africa. The sixth, I think this is the sixth, is it fifth or sixth obstacle that I've seen in Africa is the obstacle of lack of infrastructures, power, and roads and industry. Now, this is very common. And the reason why it's so is because, and I'll get to this now, but the leaders, corrupt leaders, they have no interest of their people in mind, and they get into bed with some of these Western powers. And as long as they do their bidding, they let them be. So they corrupt, they steal, they starch out money abroad, the money that should be used to develop, to provide infrastructures. Their people are, dying in hunger, dying in no good roads, no power. Take, for instance, Nigeria. Since 1989-90, I could remember of, Nigeria has never had steady power supply. Their biggest problem has been power, and every government administration will come and promise, oh, you're going to have 24/7 power supply. Who will believe that up to now, almost 30 years later, the last time I will remember any memory of Nigeria having light 24/7 is in the 70s, in the late 70s, or growing up, and in the 80s. In the 90s, to the best of my memory that I can remember, Nigeria has not been able to have steady power supply over these years, despite the billions that have been invested in that. Why? Because of corruption. So the obstacle of having lack of infrastructures, lack of good roads, lack of power, lack of industries, that have become a big problem and continues to be. So the leaders should focus on providing infrastructures, power, road, with this for their people, which is why China is gaining advantage in Africa, because China is partnering with many of these countries to help build and provide. Of course, it's not free. They're giving them loans and doing all of that, and hopefully they get to pay. If they don't get to pay, who knows if there's going to be a second version of colonization by, China. But whatever be the case, the African leaders need to pay attention to providing good roads, power, infrastructure, and building industries, or providing the enabling environment to build industries for their people. Number 6, the sixth obstacle that I see, and this is a big one, and this is one of the roots of it, the obstacle of African leaders' greed. Most of African leaders are so greedy. I mean, somebody gets into power, you are stealing billions that are meant for the people that your 10th generation can't finish. You are stealing and starting it out in banks across Europe, and one is wondering, what in the world are they thinking? I mean, I think most of them are insane. Clinically speaking, some of the African nations and leaders are insane. Otherwise, why will you be stealing billions? And okay, look, for instance, the Bongo guy in Gabon that was overthrown. If you have seen the videos, the stack of money, billions of whatever currency that was stacked, and that's the one that is with him. You know, there are billions he had stacked out in foreign bank accounts all over the place. Same thing with Nigerian leaders, past and present. Many of them, the current Nigerian leader is so corrupt that his case, in fact, today, I just saw today, the FBI said they are going to be releasing his case file in October. There's somebody who has a drug case, he has a certificate forgery case, he has all kind of, he shouldn't even be standing for an election in the first place. And yet, this is a kind of person that manipulated and rigged the election. And so the problem of African leaders and their greed and their corruption is the root of the problem of Africa. Because if they will serve their people, like you are elected in office, you want to serve, you serve your people, and not for your own greed, guess what? Africa will have been doing much better. With all the problem of the European, of the colonial powers and the scramble for partition for Africa, Africa will have been doing much better. But the problem is, because they are greedy and because most of the African leaders are corrupt, when they get in bed with the Western powers, whoever they are, when they get in bed with them, they let them go. They look the other way. Why they do havoc. And at the end of the day, listen, until African leaders learn to serve their people, until they learn to be leaders who are going to care more about their people than about their pocket, until they learn to serve without being greedy, without being corrupt, Africa still has a long way to go. So I think this is the biggest obstacle, the root. The other ones are also important, they're big, but the problem of the African leaders being greedy, being corrupt, is a big one. And because of that, they will do anything to get in power. They will kill, they will maim, they will rig elections, they do whatever they can to get into power because it's all about themselves. I challenge you to produce me an African leader. Maybe in recent times there may be one or two, but for the most part, most African leaders are corrupt. They are greedy, greed. The level of greed of the African leader, you wonder, what is all this for? At the end of the day, you drop there someday, 6 feet below the ground, you're going with none of those. So it's a sorry case, it's a sorry state. And the colonial powers have really helped them to be corrupt and helped them in their greed. I hope that changes. And finally, and this is another big one, this more of on the massive side. Finally, the obstacle, the seventh obstacle I've seen to Africa's growth is the obstacle of poverty and negative mind conditioning. Negative mind conditioning. And sometimes I don't blame people because, you see, there was a story, I narrated a story in one of my books, my first book, Persistent Works, the story about the mind conditioning process that was done. They used the monkey, the scientists used the monkey to carry out this research. When the monkey was brought in to be conditioned, they had a banana at the pole, at the end of the pole, and the monkey would normally, naturally, run to go get a banana to eat. As the monkey was climbing to go get this banana, they poured a bucket of cold water from the top, and it ran away. So every time it climbed the pole, trying to go up there to get the banana, they poured a bucket of cold water, and the monkey, ran away. After many attempts, after many days, The monkey got conditioned to the fact that, hey, you know what? I can see this banana, but I can't eat it. So he stopped trying. And then they brought another monkey into that room. The one that has been conditioned, the moment he sees the other guy climbing, trying to go, get the banana, he pulls him. He begins to pull him down. He's like, oh, don't even worry. Don't try it. I've tried it. It's not working. You can only look. You can't get it. And guess what? That happened over and over and over again. And by the time the new monkey tried many times and couldn't get, because this guy kept pulling him down, and he got conditioned to the fact that you can watch, you can see this banana, you can't eat it. He got conditioned and he gave up trying. And then they brought the third monkey. By the time they brought the third monkey, the two other monkeys who have been conditioned did the same thing to him. And that was the case until they later removed the original monkey that took the cold shower. They removed him from the room. And then you now have a bunch of new monkeys who have been conditioned that you can't go get the banana, yet they have no idea why. None of them received the cold shower. So the problem of conditioning, the devil uses this, by the way, against us as Christians, as believers. He conditions our mind. He makes us believe the wrong thing, and then he just leaves us to use our own strength and energy against ourselves. The negative mind conditioning we as Africans, our African people, the followers, and of course the leaders has had, is at the root of much of what's happening too. So there needs to be a mind reconditioning for our African people to be able to know that it's not okay to celebrate corruption. It's not okay to celebrate somebody who doesn't have integrity and credibility, and you celebrate him because he throws money around, or because he kind of parades himself as, a champion for your cause. It's not okay to accept a lot of things. But you see, poverty, because of poverty, there are a lot of things people swallow, accept, let go because of poverty. So the obstacle of poverty and negative mind conditioning is a problem. And I think African people, African leaders need to begin to have a mind reconditioning process so that they can begin to, see things in the right perspective and not believe the lie. And many of those conditioning too, the colonial masters had conditioned them. Hey, you know what? You can't take care of yourself. Oh, you can't rule yourself. You need to come cup in hand. Let's give you, come beg for aid. We need to give you aid. You can't survive without our aid. That's a lie. That is a conditioning, because the African leaders have been conditioned that, hey, you know what? You take power, you go to beg them for loan, beg them for money, beg them for aid. That is not supposed to be the case. Africa is rich in resources. It should be the other way around. Anyway, I hope that this have been able to throw some light and give some insight to you watching. And I don't know where you're watching from. I don't know if you're an African or if you're not. But you see, it's time Africa wake up. It's time African leaders wake up. It's time we understand and know the root of this problem, as we have shared in this broadcast. And I pray that Africa will once again become a shining example, because it's already blessed. Africa is blessed with people, with resources. But the problem is that it has not harnessed those resources. I pray that Africa will begin to harness its resources, that the powers that has manipulated Africa over the years, I hope that this time around, their powers will expire, that they get to treat Africa with respect and deal with them as partners and work with them for their development, for their, to be partners and not to be subjects that they think should be at their mercy. Well, I hope this broadcast has blessed you, has enlightened you. Please do share this. Let it enlighten somebody. Let it bless. If you have access to people in power, people in government, share this, send this to them. Many of them need to watch it, and maybe their eyes will begin to open, their mind conditioning will begin to change. Maybe they begin to have a rethink about the level of greed and corruption that they have been involved in, even as leaders. Well, I pray God will bless Africa and the nations of Africa. Father, I pray for the nation, the continent of Africa. Lord, as we have tried to seek and to get to the root of this problem, I pray, oh God, that you bless the continent of Africa, bless the nations of Africa. Every satanic, demonic influence, every negative influence that has been played key roles in keeping Africa down. We take authority right now in the name of Jesus, and I bind every power from the pit of hell. I bind every satanic negative force. I destroy every power that has held Africa down spiritually. And I ask, oh God, in the name of Jesus, open the eyes of your people. Let the light of your glory shine upon Africa. Let Africa discover its potential and fulfill its potential. Give the leaders, oh God, a love for their people, that they will serve them, uproot and remove greed and corruption from the hearts of the people, of the leaders of African nations. Let there be peace in Africa. Father, I pray, let there be no more bloodshed in Africa. Let there be peace. And may African leaders begin to serve their people and use their resources to be a blessing and to develop and to help the African people. I bless Africa today. I bless African nations, and I bless their leaders. I bless their people, their followers. May there be a turnaround and a rewriting of the history of Africa. And thank you, Father, because the light of your gospel is shining and will shine in and through Africa. And the powers of darkness, wherever they're coming from, whoever's sponsoring them, will come to an end, because your word says in John 1:5, and the light shined in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. The end of darkness has come in Africa, and the light of your glory shines in Africa. Thank you, Father, in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I know you've been blessed. I know you've been enlightened. I know you've been encouraged. I know for some of you, this will be eye-opening. Watch it again if you have to, and send this video to people. Share it across in your wall, in your groups, and let it be a blessing to somebody, because people need to hear this, especially those of African descent. Praise God. Well, once again, I want to thank you for today. So join me next week in another edition as we tackle another topic, another nation in global politics. Focus on today is focus on Africa. So let me also remind you to join me every day, Monday to Friday, for our Persistent Works online prayer. We come your way every day, Monday to Friday, 10 a.m. Mountain Time, 12 noon New York time, which is Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. GMT, 5 p.m. Nigerian time. Join me every day. You will be blessed as I share the word of God and pray. It's a fire prophetic prayer. You will be blessed indeed. Also, tomorrow on Thursday, every Thursday, I do host Persistent Works Moment, where I bring in guests and interview them. By the way, I have an interesting guest coming tomorrow. Don't miss it. Join me tomorrow for Persistent Works Moment as I talk, as we discuss with my guests. It's going to be a blessing. And every Tuesday, I have my Persistent Works book series where I talk about my books. So don't miss it. Join me every Tuesday. And let me also remind you, if you have not downloaded our app, hey, go to the App Store, Google Play Store, type in Persistent Works TV Network, download our TV Network app. We have over 15,000 downloads right now. We are working on 100,000 downloads, and we will get there. And next year, can't wait. Next year, we're going to have 1 million downloads of our app. That's my goal. So join me, join us, download the app, watch our TV network. We have great content that will be a blessing to you. If you have not written a review, help us write a review. We want to hear from you. Let's know what you think about the TV network. We have over 1,500 reviews in the App Store already. So let's hear from you, and we would love to hear from you through the reviews. Well, when you get to the app, I'm sure you will enjoy yourself, because there are many great content from our magazines to our books to our other materials that will be a blessing to you. So I'll reserve all the other announcements for our other broadcasts. So for now, once again, I want to thank you for your time, for joining us. And I'm sure you've been blessed today. I'm sure you've been enlightened. And I'm sure you've learned something that is going to help you even in making decisions and choices and in talking with people regarding Africa and the things going on there. So until I come your way again, I'm your host, Bishop Paul Vincent. You have been watching Global Politics Focus on Africa. Remember, Persistence Works. So I'll see you next week. God bless you. Amen.
Watching Persistence Works Television Network, PWTN, founded by Dr. Paul and Vincent, preacher, teacher, and prolific author of the popular Persistence Works book series, broadcasting the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ from El Paso, Texas to the world, and bringing you into God's presence. Experience the difference. You'll